So it's great to see each and every one of you. It's been a couple months since I've been away, so been plenty of good things that have been going on my end of the world. I am very happy with the organization that I'm a part of. Continuing to work as a management consultant in the Mayo Clinic. Was up in Rochester, Minnesota this past week. Was doing a strategic retreat with the Department of Pediatrics, which was a whole lot of fun. I can go on about that for a couple hours, doing some clinical trial work out in, I'm not on a clinical trial, but I'm doing some work trying to support clinical trials in Arizona for a lot of different things as well. A lot of good projects, a lot of good programs that are going on. So that's been going very well. And it's like a lot of you probably have seen, I'm happily engaged. I was able, kind of towards the end of my time here at University Baptist Church, I had met a young lady last summer. Actually, while I was at Baptist World Alliance representing UBC, she and I had one of our first phone conversations that while I was there in Birmingham and she was here in Houston. And we got engaged back in January. We'll be getting married at the end of this month on April 30th. So very happy about that. She has two daughters, Grace and Lucy. Grace is 8. Lucy is 9, and then Jack is still running around as a 7-year-old. So a lot of fun that's happening in these places and a lot of good things. So things are going very well. Continue to also occupy another role, not just beyond what I'm doing with Mayo, but I'm also continuing with Lancaster Bible College. Over the last year, I built 2 graduate degrees, a Master in Science and Nonprofit and a Master's in Business Administration, and continue to serve as a global program coordinator there as well as an adjunct professor. Just finished with a class on fundraising and advancement that we were doing in person, so was able to do that and then picked up my stuff and came right over here. So was glad to do that, kind of shift gears and so forth. So very glad to see each and every one of you. We spent a lot of time in this place, kind of going through the pastor's Bible study over the last number of years. And we're really able to get into some some good studies and be able to go through a lot. I know you're going through a look at the New Testament now. And as Dr. Rushing and I were able to talk a couple of weeks ago, we were able to catch up and just see where things are and how things are going. And he encouraged me to kind of come in this place and kind of just be able to take my own little route. I prayed through it and thought that, learning about apostles is very important to the New Testament because the apostles formed so much of what we know about Christianity. So I kind of took the liberty of being able to do that. I'm sure he will come back in and be happy to close off that New Testament study. But you can slide this in if you choose with your notes or just fold it in half and put it somewhere in your Bible, or you can always find the circular file if you choose to do that as well. I'm not offended. But this is kind of the form and function that I've done here in this study over the last couple of years. This is for your sanity and mine. If I only do this much content, we get through it in an hour. So we want to be a good steward. If you have not gotten a handout, make sure that you go get that. There's some folks that are walking around with them will be able to help get those as well. I will warn you that what's going to be on the screen behind me is a little bit more than what's on the handout, but it's not significantly so. I think I sourced out most everything that I wanted to cover with significance on this handout, and so we'll be able to go with that. So nevertheless, I know if we'll turn over to our notes, we will be in Scripture tonight. We will be walking through and talking about different things that are happening within Scripture, within the New Testament, getting a view in as to what's going on about the nature of apostles. So let's start kind of conversationally. When you hear this and you hear about apostles, what comes to mind? 12? That's always a good thing to start with. 12, absolutely. What else? I'm sorry? Ambassadors? Yeah. Church? Yeah. Beginning of the church, foundations of the church. What else? I'm sorry? Lots of martyrdom. We don't know a lot about what happened to the apostles. We do know that most of them, it seems to have been in Christian history, met their demise in a rather sad fashion or a rather violent fashion, and so forth. Oh, healing. Okay, healing. I thought you said killing. Okay, that's a lot different. It's like the exact opposite. So, a lot of healing. Yeah, so apostles had that unique thing. So, They were gifted in a lot of different ways. When Christ said, go into all the world and make disciples, he also included with those commissions that they're going to be kind of that empowering that goes with it. So yes, healing, quite the opposite of killing. So, yes. One who is sent out. Yeah, that's kind of one of the things that we get into. So, as we look at the apostles, what we're going to do, I'm going to kind of do what I like to do with teaching. I like to go through a PowerPoint, so we're going to have that on the screen, and we're just going to use that as kind of our guide as we go through with what we're doing. You'll see that one of the questions that we want to ask tonight is, what is an apostle? We want to talk about what they are, who they are. We're not going to really get into the different personalities of the apostles. You could do, many years ago, here's a little fun fact about me. When I was a junior, just in between my junior and senior year at Liberty University, in my undergraduate degree, or my undergraduate studies, I should say, I was hired by my home church in Maryland to start to do a children's summer day camp. And one of the things, they gave me enough time in the summer. It was basically it was an 8 to 12 camp that we offered a couple days a week. It was essentially a Mother's Day out kind of a thing, or a Parents' Day out kind of a deal. And they would get dropped off, and we'd have all kinds of stuff. We had field trips, we had all kinds. But to do the Bible lesson, the first summer that I ever did that, we did the lives of the 12 apostles. And we walked through, and you can do a whole study on the 12 apostles. You get real thin on some of the material, but you can do it. But you can do that. You can find out kind of hear about what had happened, what had gone on with them, things that had happened, things that had gone on. And what we're going to do tonight, we won't talk about the individual apostles. We're going to talk about the office of apostle and its impact on the New Testament and what it goes in with that. So with that, you'll see we're going to pick up. This is the first thing that you'll see is my title slide. One of the things that's always important when you get into talking about anything in history is being able to consider how has it been interpreted through the ages? How has it been interpreted over the last number of years? This is Taddeo Di Bartolo had actually painted this artwork called Christ and the 12 Apostles. This is a pretty typical work of the formal term of it is called hagiography, but it's an iconography, but it is from the Eastern tradition, and you can see that Christ being in the middle, and then you have the 12 apostles, Matthias being one of them, kind of working out from that. There's a lot of other things that go in, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the art that we get into. But tonight we're going to be talking about what is an apostle, and there's often a lot of talk about apostles, but rarely a significant study about what makes up an apostle, what an apostle is, and how they are portrayed. We're not always aware of that. And so to do this, I just want to we're going to go through some of these really quickly, some definitions, some ancient correlations, biblical portrayal, historical Christian understanding, as well as applications for today. So I always want to come back and get the whole view of it. What does the Bible say about it? What does Christian history say about it? And then what can we know for today? I think that's one of the real things that you want to get into when you talk about the apostles. When you talk about really any topic, how can we understand it and apply it today? This is another piece of artwork that's rather significant. This is hanging in the Kimbrell Art Museum in Fort Worth. If you haven't gone up to Fort Worth to see the Kimbrell, I'd encourage you to do so. It's a very good art museum that's there. This is a work called The Seven Sacraments. This is ordination, and this is from Nikolaus Poussin. It was done probably in or around 1636, and this is a fairly typical depiction of the apostles, things that you can see with that. Jesus obviously off to the side, off to the left. You can see the way that they're portrayed, and a couple of things kind of in that hillside, countryside kind of a depiction, as best he could understand what was going on with that. You see that this is the ordination of them. One of the things that's intriguing about this is he includes an apostle that a lot of us wouldn't include, and who would that be? Judas. And he does something, it's kind of hard to see on the screen. You can kind of see it if you're in person, maybe if you're online also as well. Judas is over here off to the side. And you'll notice that Judas is depicted, now we don't want to take this the wrong way, because it could be that Judas is depicted as another ethnicity. But that's not what Poussin's doing. It's not what Da Vinci does. It's not what, we'll see that in a moment, what some of these others do. But rather, the idea of the artist is that he exists in the shadows. There is a shadow that's cast across him. Because even in this ordination, there is this idea, and we'll see here in the text in a moment, that Judas, though he was named in and among the apostles in the Gospels, though he obviously didn't carry through to Acts, he was carried in a unique way. He's represented in art in a unique way. This is a work that you probably are all familiar with. This is Da Vinci's The Last Supper, and this was really done about the 1495, 1498. You can find this in Milan if you're ever over in the area, and you'll be able to go see this in person. This is obviously a very big painting, and you can spend hours looking at it. You'll notice a couple things about this. The apostles are grouped in threes. That there's four groups of threes. Really, if you want to go from the left to the right, this is Bartholomew. This is James, the son of Alphaeus. This is Andrew. Right here is Judas. And again, Judas is depicted darkly, not because he's in a different ethnicity, but rather that he's in the shadows. And then you have, out of Judas, you have Peter right here. Then you have John in the middle. This is Jesus. And then over here you have Thomas. You have James the Greater. And then, good that James the Less and James the Greater aren't sitting next to each other. But Philip over here, and then you have Matthew, Jude, and Simon. I always like to call him Simon the Zealot. And again, one of the things that we find personality-wise is how intriguing it is for Christ. You look at this depiction. You have Matthew, who was a Hellenist tax collector, somebody who was Jewish by birth, who had given himself over to the Roman system. He was collecting taxes in the face of those of his own people, from his own people, to give to the despots that were overriding them, that were kind of controlling them. And then, so you have Matthew, but then you have Simon Zelotes, is what he's called in the Greek, Simon the Zealot. And the Zealots were a group of Jewish radicals in the first century that carried out assassinations. They carried out hits on Hellenists. And imagine being in the room where Matthew, the tax collector, and Simon the Zealot were sitting next to each other, respectively, talking about things. And we see how that goes. So it's just intriguing when we think about it as well. One last little piece, and I'll move on from the art. This is Giotto di Bone. This is a representation of Pentecost, and this is hosted in London's National Gallery. It comes from about 1310. This is a very good depiction of Eastern iconography that goes in with the apostles. You'll notice it's kind of hard to see because we haven't really blown it up, but you'll see up here you have the Holy Spirit, which is the dove. Then you have the apostles with these little flames of fire on their heads. And this is the day of Pentecost. This is the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. All key functions, all key parts of the story of the apostles that are depicted in different ways, and so forth. So for the group that was able to go to Israel over the last, back over towards the end of the year, first of the year, you're able to go into those places where the traditional Last Supper was offered. You're able to go into those places and spaces where they would have walked, where they would have been. And you can understand the nature of what happens in those rooms, in those spaces. It's amazing to think about the legacy and the imprint that these people had about what they were doing to impact Christ, to impact the kingdom of God forever. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the apostles. So let's get started and do so. So what is an apostle? Well, we'll begin up here. From the New Testament and the early Christian age, this references a group of commissioned individuals who are sent out by Jesus and formed an early missionary movement to expand Christian communities and preach the gospel in order to make disciples. You'll notice on the handout that I threw out the Greek word, which is apostolos. This is the principal word, apostolon, depending upon the gender, for that's described, or the plurality of apostoloi. This is the Greek word that's used in the New Testament to depict apostles. You'll see that in the notes. But this is a group of commissioned individuals. Notice how we break out the definition of the apostles here. One, it's a group of commissioned individuals. Apostles are a group of people that were in the early part of Christianity, early Christian age in the New Testament, that were commissioned uniquely. They created an early missionary movement. Now, I've already begun kind of parsing out, kind of laying out some of the language that I'm going to get into as we go through this study. I really view the apostles as the first missionaries. One of the things that I know that UBC is a part of, whether we like it or not, no, whether we like it, is the Southern Baptist Convention. You got to have somebody who's sane in the room, but and we can be that. But yeah, we work with Southern Baptists. We also work with the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. We work with Baptist World Alliance. But in the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the things that is so amazing about the convention, I tell people all the time, this is a joke I told for years here, and everybody laughed politely, was that I was a Southern Baptist 9 months before I was born. And it's been really fantastic to grow up in that kind of a church because so much of the DNA and the ethos of Southern Baptist is a missionary movement. You get away all the politics, you get away all the junk, you get away all the personalities, you get away all the people that are in the midst of it with the controversies that go on. And the heart of what we do is a missionary force that goes out into the world to change the world on behalf of a kingdom that is to come. And that is found initially in the model of the apostles. The apostles serve for us as an example of early missionaries. And we're going to get into a little bit of that, what that looks like and so forth. But they were sent out by Jesus and formed an early missionary movement to expand Christian communities. And one of the things that I've posited quite often is that it might very well be that multiple apostles ended up in the same city. I actually think that Ephesus is a great example of a city that could very well have had 3 to 4 to 5 different churches aligned with different apostles by the midpoint of the first century. There seems to be something that develops. There is a Petrine church, there's a Pauline church, there's an Apollian church. Could very well be a Johannine community that's in there, and they all had their different expressions that go in. It doesn't mean that they were in competition, but it's one of those things that we recognize. There's a reason that Clear Lake has more than one church, because one church can't reach Clear Lake. We need a bunch of churches to reach Clear Lake. We need a bunch of churches to reach Houston. We need a bunch of them to go out into those different places, and the different wards, and the different suburbs, and the different places and spaces to be able to do that because they appeal to people in different ways. This is intrinsic to what we do in Christianity, and the apostles give us an example. The other thing that's really critical here is this last phrase. They preach the gospel, because this goes right back to their commission. They preach the gospel, the evangelion. They preach that gospel. They're the heralds, the messengers of the gospel, which we're going to unpack here in a few moments, in order, and notice what we're doing. We're not making converts, but rather we're making what? Which is disciples. And it does remind us that there is a difference between an apostle and a disciple in the New Testament. There are a whole lot of disciples in the New Testament. There weren't as many apostles, but there's a whole lot of disciples in the New Testament. How we go out from our places as we go and make disciples of all those spaces is really amazing to see what goes on. Apostleship is a part of discipleship. And to be an apostle, you have to begin by being a disciple. So it's a really critical part of this as well. The original 12 apostles were drawn from the followers of Jesus' ministry. This is something that seems to be intrinsic. If you could, turn over to Matthew chapter 10. I told you we're going to spend a little bit of time in Scripture. I'm going to get some stuff up behind me to support that as well. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to start off with a pretty simple passage, and you'll notice in this passage that I have there, I also have a couple cross-references from the Mark and the Lucan parallels that are in there. And notice what it says in Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 3. And actually, I'm going to pull it up right here. I've got it right here. We go. There it is. So summoning the 12 disciples, he gave them the authority over unclean spirits to drive them out and to heal every disease and sickness. This is verse 2. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, Simon the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, and Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot who betrayed him. So the apostles come out very early on. And what's intriguing in the Gospels, all the parallel passages that go across the synoptics being the first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they carry a similar timeline. John's a little bit different. John has a different purpose for what he's doing. But you'll see that there are these first images of the apostles. They're not called the 12 disciples. They're called the 12 apostles right from the get-go. And that should mark them off as something unique, something that's going on. These names, this is something that I don't want to get into very significantly, but the names that are used here. Now, we've Latinized the names. So if anybody ever comes to you and says, well, you're just using a bunch of letters that don't ever exist in Hebrew or in Aramaic or something like that, it's not really true. What we've done is we've Latinized the names. And that's a natural part of how words develop. But all of these names in their original forms, you can find evidences of them in Galilean and Palestinian communities in the first century. They're exactly where they're supposed to be. The names that are used here, they sound very modern to us, but in their original context were exactly where they were supposed to be. One of the great eyewitnesses of the New Testament is that the names that appear across the pages of Scripture, actually goes to the Old Testament as well, when we look historically in, they are exactly where they're supposed to be. We find archaeological evidence linking them to it. Richard Bauckham's written a great book. I encourage you guys to go read it, called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. I'm not going to get into it much longer than that, just to say it's a really amazing confirmation. These names are exactly where they were supposed to be. If you and I were to sit down and write a book, we were going to sit down and write a historical fiction book about the Revolutionary War, we'd have to create some names. We probably wouldn't think to go back and look to see what names were popular in the Revolutionary War. We'd probably name them after people that we know, and they would be wrong, because names in the Revolutionary War time are very different. But here in the New Testament, they're exactly where they're supposed to be. But notice what Matthew does, and you see this across Mark as well, as well as Luke. They carry these names out, they give them a little bit of identification, and notice who is always last. It's Judas. Judas is always last. They always reserve a special bit of however characterization you want to put into that on Judas. Judas is often known as a betrayer. And so forth. So we see that it goes in. Let's pick back up here. A couple notes. So this is an early Christian passage on the apostles. I actually think that Matthew's source document is Mark. I think Mark's source document was Peter laying on a bed, having Mark actually transcribe it to him. I can get into that another time if you want. But I do think that Matthew's source document is Mark. I think Luke's source document is Matthew and Mark. So just for what it's worth, that's one of the reasons that it happens. They just happen to be in this order for a couple different other reasons. But yeah. You can also get into Jude. You can also get into Judas. Judas Iscariot is that other one who betrays him. Yeah. And we're going to talk about that, Todd. We're going to talk about the expansion of the apostolic office here in a couple moments. There's some interesting stuff that goes on with the text with that. For sure, with that. Yeah, so, but the early Christian passage on the apostles, this is the commissioning by Jesus of existing disciples. You'll notice that Jesus doesn't go and try to find a bunch of people that are adherents of other people or other ways or other followers of other rabbis, but he rather takes people that are already following him. He gives them authority to go do ministry. Notice the nature of the authority that he gives them. He gives them the authority to do what? To over unclean spirits, and to heal every disease and sickness. This is two of the things that we know about Jesus. When you look at all the critical scholars in the world, right now where we stand, you look at the things even the most skeptical scholars agree on, if they agree that Jesus existed, which we have very good reason and evidence to think that he did. We obviously do, but when you're talking about skeptical audiences, they will agree that Jesus, if they break him down, these are the most skeptical scholars that are out there, will say at least two things about him that they know. Three things. One, that he lived in the time when we think he lived, but also that he was an exorcist as well as a healer. He did miracles. And notice what Jesus does. He takes those two marks of definition for his own divinity. He takes the two marks of the thing that he is in and of himself, and he puts them into his apostles. He gives them to the apostles and say, as you go out of here, you carry the same things that are the marks of my ministry as you go out. And it's a fascinating thing that happens there. So we see that he gives them authority to do ministry, and that ultimately Jesus sends them out with instructions. That's something that goes on with that. You can get into that passage as well as you want to. One other passage that I want to touch on real quick. I won't spend a lot of time. This is Ephesians chapter 4, 11 through 13. You can write this down on the side if you want to, or in the little notes page, or little notes piece that I gave you on the back. This is what I think to be the pinnacle of Pauline ecclesiology. This is Paul's doctrine of the church. And in Ephesians, we have two parts. Remember, we went through in this room a number of years ago. We went through the entire book of Ephesians, right as the pandemic was coming. We didn't know it was coming, but there it was. And as the pandemic landed, we were in the middle of a study on Ephesians. And I talked about Ephesians being about two parts of a book. It was about the purpose of God's plan and the people of God's plan. So the first half of Ephesians is the purpose of God's plan. The second half of Ephesians is the people of God's plan. But in Ephesians chapter 4, I think Paul works out his very basic definition of what it is to be a local New Testament church. And he gets into the middle of it, and he says this, and he gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, to build up the body of Christ, until we all reach the unity in the faith and in the knowledge of God's Son, growing into maturity with a stature measured by Christ's fullness. Look at that first verse in there, verse 11. What you'll get, now this is one of the things that happens in a lot of churches, or not a lot of churches, with a lot of Christian communities that go on, is that sometimes we get these spiritual gift tests that come out. And one of the things that they'll include is they'll include Ephesians chapter 4 as a part of the spiritual gifts that are in the New Testament. The challenge with this is that they're not spiritual gifts. These are offices in the first century Christian communities. Notice what they've got. Notice it's right there. He gave some, Jesus gave himself, he himself gave some to be what? Apostles. That's an external office. Prophets, that's an external office. Some to be evangelists. That's an external office. Some to be pastors and teachers. Those are two internal offices. So we want to make sure that we're not confused. And there's some well-meaning people that put together spiritual gifts tests, and I understand what they're trying to do, but these are offices of the New Testament church. You go back into the documents of the first earliest churches, not just inside the New Testament, but also the extra biblical documents that we have, and you'll see that these communities had external functions that were going on, external offices. They had people that would come and go, and one of the things that we've really lost in a lot of churches, we've lost as a whole, but we still have it as Southern Baptists, we've lost the office of evangelist, of people that will come in and they'll kind of do the work of evangelism, not on our behalf, but training up people to do it. It's a really fascinating thing to see. But then you also see in those documents the prophets that are out there. And they're not talking about the Old Testament prophets. We're talking about people that had a prophetic a viewpoint in the world. But then the other one of those is the apostles. Now, we are going to say about what happens to that office here in a little bit, but this is what happens in Paul's day. The force and focus of the new church, of the local church, is to be an organization that is set unto itself, that has elected, raised up leadership from within, that is not determined from outside, but has a pastor and pastors and teachers at its center point for how it leads itself, to distribute it out to become the fullness of Christ. That we don't have this hierarchy that exists, but rather that it's a group of people all coming together for the benefit of the kingdom. But nevertheless, so where does this term of apostle come from? I'm going to go through this a little bit, probably a little bit better of a clip. This is TLDR. If you're wondering what TLDR is, this is too long, didn't read. That's an acronym you might see some younger people use. I learned it a couple weeks ago. I'm going to use it here. So too long, didn't read, we really don't know. Just being honest. I've read a lot of the stuff on this. We don't really know. We're not really sure where the term came from. We have some ideas. One, there's not a direct correlation in the Old Testament with the term. There's a mishmash of offices that exist, particularly in the later stage of the Old Testament. There's offices that exist, particularly as Israel, well, not Israel, but the tribe of Judah and Benjamin come back from captivity. The kind of the rabbinical system that gets developed in the book of Ezra. There's not a direct correlation. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, it's a translation of the Old Testament, uses a parallel term, but the focus is on the messenger. The closest term that we have, which is where we get this idea of apostolos or apostle from, is the connotation of a messenger or an agent. Somebody already said that here. We talked about it's a messenger. It's somebody that's sent out. It's somebody that goes out. So the very understanding, because again, we recognize that the New Testament doesn't arise in a vacuum. It doesn't come out of the sky and get dropped on the ground, because that's not how God works. It doesn't have an angel that gives you special spectacles that one person's only able to interpret, and it's just a bunch of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics anyways. But rather that it comes through a natural process. That natural process is because it's embedded in a social context. It's embedded in this context that allows it to arise. The closest term that we can understand means messenger or agent. It doesn't mean authority. It means a messenger. And notice this, some scholars have thought that the Hebrew term shaliach is the Old Testament term that precedes the New Testament usage. I don't buy this. Some people do. I don't. I think and kind of where we get to this is there's something unique happening in the office of the apostle. because we see that it has intricacies that are not and nuances that aren't present. However, the New Testament use, which extends through the earliest days of Christian communities, seems to have some unique aspects. One of the things that I think happens in the earliest churches, you see this in how Paul raises up congregations. He often uses the forms and the metaphors of those communities in which they go. You look at Colossians, you look at the Ephesians, you look at the Philippians, you look at the Corinthians. There are aspects of those churches that are unique to their context. The people that he raises up and he names are unique to their context. He has this thing that he does where he adapts and adopts what's going on in the culture. I actually think that the office of apostle is an adaptation of this idea of messenger with a kingdom orientation, that they become missionaries. And what's so intriguing about this term is we do not find, and wait for this, we do not find a comparable office in other religions of this time where people went out with service to others as the formative way that they were expanding their religion. How did people expand their religion in the first century? Primarily force. A sword. You go in and you take them all over and you're like, hey, do you want to convert? Oh, you don't? Oh, we'll just cut a couple heads off. After about 4 or 5, you guys will start getting the hint. And then people convert. That's how primitive religion was spread. You didn't have these people going into communities and going on behalf of somebody else for a kingdom that we can't see, that isn't about military, but it's about service, it's about altruism, it's about something greater and deeper. But that's what the apostles do. So there's an aspect of uniqueness that goes on with the apostle or the apostolic office. I think it's an innovation in Christianity. I think Christianity has a number of innovations that exist in the first century that happen in spite of the larger culture, but take on aspects of the larger culture. So the term apostle doesn't arise in a vacuum, and there are some historical uses which might inform the development of the term. I'm going to go through one of these. I'm going to skip over a couple of the other ones. This is from Herodotus. This is from his histories. This came out in about 450 BCE, and you'll notice that in this text, and you can go to his history, this history's book 1, chapter or paragraph 21, or chapter 21, however you want to do it. You'll see that right here, the word apostolos, which is the word apostle. You look at the top of the page up there, it's the same word. It's this word right here. So the envoy went to Miletus. So you'll notice that there's an idea of a messenger or an envoy or somebody that's sent on behalf of a king or a major or a ruler or something like that. Another example, this is from Josephus in Antiquities. This was written from about 90 CE or the end of the first century, and you'll see the two terms of apostolon and apostolantes, which also go into the embassy, as well as now the number of ambassadors that were sent by the authority of the nation. So we see this idea of messenger that comes out of it, and so forth. I don't want to spend too awful much time on that. But there is a sense that the term apostle carries some specific force in the New Testament and early Christian usage that is unique. And you'll notice a couple of the key things. One, the apostles are commissioned by Jesus. Go through and look at the Matthew passage. Look at the Mark or the Luke parallels. Jesus is actively commissioning them. When you look at Paul's commissioning as an apostle himself, you look at those things that go on, his own testimony to it, Jesus is the person who commissioned Paul to be an apostle. There's a great book out there by a guy named F.F. Bruce called Paul, the Apostle of a Heart Set Free. It's an amazing journey about Paul, and you probably have it in the library right here too. Pat always keeps really good books there. Also, we see that the apostles are sent out. Apostles aren't retained. Notice that's so interesting. You raise these people up, you train these people up, and what do you immediately do? You give them a job and you pay them a check. No, you don't. What do they immediately do? They send them out. That happens throughout all these communities. The apostles aren't retained in Jerusalem. They're sent out from Jerusalem. The apostles are not expected to stay in their home country. You can't stay in your home country. Now, some of them did, but most of them all go other places. The history of the Christian history, the Christian legend about Thomas. Where did Thomas go? Does anybody know? India. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Thomas is the one who goes over to India, and we have good reason to believe he actually did. And he probably encountered the Mongols, and he probably encountered some other stuff that was gone over there too. You go and you read histories of that era later on. There's a thing that happens within a couple hundred years.
We had a seminary student from India whose name was exactly what we're saying, Thomas.
There you go. You had a seminary student from India. He had a Christian name, Thomas. There's a tradition that goes with him in that region. He carried it out. We know that the apostles spread across the entire Mediterranean and down into Africa and into the known world. Also, the apostles carry the gospel with them. They're constantly being portrayed as having that with them. The apostles go out to start new Christian communities. The Pauline model is he would go into a town or into a city, he would find a way to get in, and he'd begin making disciples. He would raise up a church, establish a church, and then he would leave that church, and he'd go start another one. We see it throughout Acts. We see it throughout his letters, how he does this. It's amazing. He doesn't go and he doesn't take people from outside that context, but rather he raises up leaders from within the context and leaves those leaders there. Because the goal, the idea that Paul had wasn't an outside authority making decisions for the new local church, but rather the local church making those decisions themselves. The apostles have a divine calling and appointment. And this is what's really critical, and we'll bounce through this pretty quick. We'll bounce through some of the other slides fairly quickly. Notice this. This is how you become an apostle in the New Testament. One, an eyewitness of the resurrected Jesus. You had to be an eyewitness of the resurrected Jesus. The other part of that is you had to be directly called to be an apostle by Jesus. I've given you some passages about this as well. Paul recognizes that he was personally called in Corinthians as well. And then you have a demonstrated true signs of apostolic ministry. That you demonstrated true signs of apostolic ministry. So we want to know that that's what's going on with that as well. So we see that there are qualifications, or not qualifications, anybody can be an apostle, but that there are criteria by which an apostle is granted that title. And that is so very important around that. So the apostles ultimately, they're in the New Testament, the apostles are a group that initially begins with 12 and then seems to expand. And I know that's an interesting concept to throw out there, but I actually have pretty good reason for it, because we know we had the original 12. Once Judas wasn't really in that mix, who was the new one? Does anybody remember? We already mentioned him. Matthias. And who was the 13th apostle? Who? Paul. Who was the 14th apostle? Barnabas. Now this is where we get a little bit mixed up, because it could have very well been Barnabas and then Paul. Paul wouldn't have cared. Barnabas probably wouldn't have either. What are some other apostles that are out there in the New Testament? Does anybody know? These are named people who are called apostles in different letters. Apollos? Yeah. Who else? James, the brother of Jesus, is one. You look in Galatians, you'll see that. We think he's a different James than James the son of Alphaeus or James the Greater. Silas, Timothy, Epaphroditus. There's also two unnamed apostles in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. There's also another set of two unnamed apostles. And then you have the more controversial apostle. What's that apostle's name? Eutychus. Go to Romans chapter 16, you'll see Paul talk about, and Eutychus, who is prominent among the apostles. It is, to me, and this is where I come from, is that Eutychus is a female name. It's very clear, given the textual criticism that we have, that it is a woman, and she's being called an apostle by Paul. So the apostolic office wasn't confined to just men, it included women. We have histories within the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity that there were women apostles that were identified within the first followers of Jesus as well. There's an interesting book out there. I don't agree with everything that's in it. It's called The Lady Was a Bishop. It's called The Lady Was a Bishop, and it's a fantastic look into that topic. So we see that the idea of the apostles expands. The office expands. It's not just limited to the original 12 plus Matthias. It's not just limited to the original 12 plus Paul. It's not just limited to the original 12 plus Matthias and Paul and Barnabas. It just keeps growing and growing. It's very likely that the apostles proliferated, that they were able to, in their own unique way, see and meet these criteria. Apollos does seem to be one of them as well. So we see that there's a notable expansion with Paul, Epaphroditus, we already mentioned that. Eunia could have been a female apostle. There's some other named apostles. But the idea of the office of apostle is not static. It doesn't seal up with the addition of Matthias in Acts chapter 1. But rather there's something else that's going on. However, this is where it becomes interesting. There is a clear closure of the office by the end of the first century. However, there is a clear closure of the office by the end of the first century. Now, what grounds can I make that on? Well, I've read a whole bunch of patristic literature. And by that I mean I've read a whole bunch of the literature from the first century to the 4th to 5th century that are from extra biblical writers. And I would challenge, this is what I challenge everybody to do, find me an example of a current day identified apostle into the first century where the authors, the writers, and that goes into people like Augustine, that goes into Justin Martyr, that goes into a whole bunch of people like Cyprian, or even get into you get into a lot of these other church fathers that are out there, Tertullian that goes in there as well. Find me an example of somebody who talks about the office being active from the 2nd century on, and I'll be shocked because I looked. I couldn't find it. So that's really intriguing because that means that the office seals and that they seal the office and there are no more apostles, but we now have missionaries. We now have local churches doing the bulk of the work. It took a little while to get there, but they got there. And when they got there, guess where the primary location of the work of the kingdom? It was the local church. It wasn't some office in Rome. That didn't exist for at least 600. But it was a local church. Yes?
What about those preachers today that call themselves entitled apostles?
You knew exactly what I was getting ready to talk about. What about those preachers that are on TBN that the apostle thus and such? They're absolutely not. Have you ever seen the movie by Robert Duvall called The Apostle? Yes. Has anybody seen that movie? What does he do to commission himself to be an apostle? Does anybody remember? Other than killing the guy. Well, almost killing the guy with the bat. He baptizes himself. You want to see a really interesting movie? That's an interesting movie. It's called The Apostle. It's Robert Duvall. And it came out like in the, when was it? Like the early 2000s, something like that? Yeah. Yeah. It's a really fascinating movie. So those folks that you see on TV, now here's the other thing that I know, because I also know, you go back, this is one of my favorite ones to go into, go look at Tertullian, who's an ancient writer. He talks about people that were trying to create apostles called the Marcionites, or not the Marcionites. He talks about a group of people that were trying to create apostles in their own sect, and he calls them a heresy. And it's a really fascinating look at it, because every time the apostles appear from the 2nd century on as being an active office, it's always under the guise of being false teachers. And you don't find an example. So there's something that happens in the nature of early Christianity for what goes on with that. So if you see those folks on TBN or on Daystar or whatever you see, I remember I had a guy come up to me and tell me one time he was an apostle of Jesus Christ. And I went, okay, when would you see Jesus resurrected? And he was like, what are you talking about? He said, the bishop this and such anointed me an apostle. I said, no, he didn't. We got into a little bit of a frustration moment. I pulled out my Bible, had it on me, and then he told me I was going to hell. So that's how we end conversations. But anyways, no, it's one of those things. I mean, it's complicated, but we see that in the history of Christianity, they closed the office of apostle. Now, we're not going to get into the Catholic dogma about all this stuff, but just say that that's where I'm at. Happy to have a conversation about it. So what do apostles do? Well, let's go through this rather quickly. They appear to be the early missionary force, to spread Christianity around the world, not just in the Mediterranean region. They seem to be the early missionary force to do that. A part of their work, they start Christian communities in cities and towns. They go in. This is the model. This is one of the things that we did a couple of years, actually probably about 2 years ago in here. We talked about the missionary journeys of Paul. We went through the book of Acts. And what we did is we walked through and you see Paul went here and he started a church, and he started a church, and he started a church, and he started a church. Well, they were all doing that. And what's so intriguing about it is that's the model that we see. They started churches. They started, and by churches I mean they started local Christian communities in cities and towns. Alexander the Great? It would have been a bit before the apostles, I think. He was a bit before that era. Now, what's the interesting thing about Alexander is how fast he spread all the way over there. Actually, one of the books I read last year was Philip and Alexander. It was a book about like that thick. I got inspired because when we took a bunch of people to Greece, we stopped off at a little hill in the middle of a gravel parking lot, and we found out that it was the tomb of Philip II of Macedon, just off the highway. We got to go in and look around, but I was fascinated by it, so I looked at Alexander's just a bit earlier than the apostles in his timeline. Yeah, so he's an interesting representation of somebody who goes out, but notice how he goes out to spread his religion, or of the sword, of Greece, and then he ultimately capitulates a little bit. Well, he passes away for a lot of reasons, but yeah, so I mean, there's a little bit of that as well. So as a part of the work, they start Christian communities in cities and town, and there appears to be a group of apostles who keep the gospel and initial theological statements pure and true. You go to Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council. Notice that the appeal in Acts chapter 15 is to a group of apostles and elders in the church. We actually got that passage right here. Let's see if I can pull it up real quick. This is Acts chapter 15. Acts chapter 15, verses 4 through 6, and then 22. When they arrived at Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church, the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done. Now, who's arriving at the church? Well, this is Paul, and he's coming from having a time where he was around Cornelius. And they saw multiple visions, and then they also were able to see the expansion of the kingdom to include the Gentiles. And Paul's convinced of this because of the work of the Spirit that had happened. And he goes to Jerusalem, and he was welcomed by the church, the apostles, and the elders. They reported all that God had done with them. But some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, "It is necessary to circumcise them and command them to keep the law of Moses." And the apostles and the elders gathered to consider this. And then verse 22, and when the apostles and elders with the whole church decided to select men who were among them to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, Judas called Barsabbas and Silas, both leading men among the brothers. The apostles had an incredibly important role, and we shouldn't diminish their role. While they were not hierarchical in their office, they were not ecclesiastical in their authority, they were the vanguards by which the true religion that was given by Christ was guarded. They were the ones who protected it. They're the ones who helped transmit it. They were so often the ones who transcribed it and wrote it down. And they had an incredibly important role for what they did. They carried the gospel with them. They carried the gospel into so many places throughout the world. A couple other things. Let's see if we can go through this. The apostles also carry a weight within early Christian communities that bears pointing out. Jesus is considered to be, I probably jumped a couple, there you go. The apostles are to train up leaders and lead them with the local church. Jesus is considered to be the apostle and the great high priest. Peter indicates that the apostles are linked to scriptural writings. That's in 1 Peter 2, 3, verses 1 and 2. I put the F there because I didn't have enough room for the dash. So if you ever see an F following a number in somebody's writing, it's the F is for following. If you see two Fs, it's for following. So it's basically 2 Peter 3, 1 and 2. If you saw 2 Peter 3, 1 FF, it'd be 2 Peter 3, 1, 2, and 3. Just a little shorthand for you. I didn't have enough space. I didn't want to make the font smaller. But anyways, Peter indicates that the apostles are linked to scriptural writings. There is a recognition of authority, or this idea of inspiration and inscripturation that goes on with the apostles. Paul also points out that there are false apostles in 2 Corinthians 11:14, and super apostles. He's using this colloquially. He's actually making fun of them. We'll go there here in a second. In 2 Corinthians 11:5 and 12:11, who have led some astray. Now, these super apostles did not have capes. They did not have things underneath their shirts. They did not go into phone booths and transform into something fantastic. But rather, he's using it kind of in a biting way to say there are some people who think that they're even above the apostles. They're even above those apostles. They're super apostles. And he's basically deriding them politely to point out that they're a part of the false apostles. We know that in early Christianity, there were a lot of people that walked around claiming to be apostles, but they weren't. There's an ancient document called the Didache The Didache, which I believe was written in about 75, it's a very, that's of the first century. It's a very ancient document about ancient liturgies and ancient ways that the church was constructed. It talks about being aware of false apostles, people that will come to your church, your local community, and be like, hey, I'm an apostle, because you don't have a photo library, because God hadn't created the man who, or invented the man who invented the photography. You don't really know, so you got to do background check, and then 5 months later, they're still hanging out at your house, eating all your food. They're like, there's got to be a better test. So the Didache creates a test for apostles so they can get these people that were just kind of holding on and lingering on. They were basically kind of just doing that to local early Christian communities that go in there with that. There were tests that had to be created as well. Also, we see that the 12 apostles are linked together with the 12 tribes of Israel. There is something significant about that. We should not miss this. There were 12 tribes of Israel. There are 12 apostles. There's something that's going on in the midst of this teaching, this New Testament ethic that's out there. There is a direct correlation between the two. We can't miss it. One of the reasons is because when we look in Revelation, and we see in Revelation 21 that new city has foundations who are named after the 12 apostles. In Revelation 21:14, the apostles are named on the 12 foundations of the heavenly city. And it says this. It says, that the city had a massive wall with 12 gates. 12 angels were at the gates. The names of the 12 tribes of Israel's sons were inscribed on the gates, and there were gates on the east. There were 3 gates in the north, 3 gates in the east, 3 gates in the south, 3 gates in the west. And the city wall had 12 foundations, and the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb were on the foundations. This is a depiction, however we can understand it, of that heavenly city that was shown to John. And in the midst of it, he looks and he sees, and as he does his best to describe it, he sees the 12 tribes of Israel, he sees the 12 apostles, and they're in the same marcation in the city. There's something going on. There's something being leveraged here. Jesus comes to bring a new way of following. He does so using, and for rightly so, because he is himself Jewish, using the stories of the Old Testament and the models of the Old Testament to do something great in this new covenant era. We don't know much about what happens to the original 12, but there are many documents of early Christianity attesting to their various martyrdom. It is generally accepted that of the original 12, only one of them died a natural death, and who was that? And why did John die a natural death? Because he was faithful to Christ at the cross. And he was given Christ's mother. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. All the rest of them died these excruciating deaths. Peter was crucified upside down. Multiple of them were thrown in with lions. They were beheaded. They were cut asunder. All that kind of stuff. Sawn in half. It's just crazy stories. Not bedtime reading. Good reading, but not bedtime reading. Important reading. And so forth. But we don't know exactly what happens. One of the other confusing parts about this, and we talked about this when we went through the book of Acts, is that Acts has a very clear division. The first half of Acts seems to be incredibly occupied with Peter. The second half of Acts, whereabouts, is incredibly occupied with Paul. But not a lot of the other apostles appear. And we're not sure why. Maybe Luke was just trying to save space. Or maybe there's a broader story that's going on. Well, as we're wrapping up, so what can we learn from this? What can we learn from the apostles? What can we learn from the model that they give us for life? What can we learn from what the New Testament teaches us? Well, one, an apostle is a historical office originating from the early followers of Jesus, of commissioned missionaries, spreading the gospel and planting new Christian communities in the first century. This is what I believe to be the best definition of an apostle. That apostle was a missionary. That an apostle was one of those ones sent. And what's so intriguing, and we go back to this, and I'll pause here because think about this. We just talked about their martyrdoms. We just talked about the afflictions that they saw. We just talked about how they were sent out in a time where you didn't have superhighways, where you didn't have a Bank of America that you could go around the corner and get your cash out of to pay for the Whataburger that was awaiting you on the way, but rather it was a very different place and space and time where people were not friendly to strangers, where people were not friendly to those folks coming from the countryside and other nations nonetheless. And these people went out taking with them an authority that was other of themselves and were afflicted, they were oppressed, they were martyred. And then we're supposed to believe that they didn't actually see the resurrected Christ. We're supposed to believe that they only made it up in their heads, that 12 of them got together and completely tried to fool the world by saying, well, we saw this guy go into the clouds and got it beat out of them for generations, got it absolutely taken out of them physically. We had to go through all the stuff that they went through, when all they had to do is stand up and say, you know what, we made it up. It's not true. I don't see it, because something changed every single one of these people. Something changed every single one of them. It's probably, and the best evidence that we have is Jesus changed them, because they saw a man that they put in a tomb who was alive on the third day and walked among them in a resurrected form for 40 more. And it's amazing to think that these 12 went out of that place once they were coupled with the 120 on that day of Pentecost to start a new community, and that they changed the world through it, and they became the missionary example for us. So they absolutely must have known Christ and Christ crucified, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 2:2. Apostles were not high ecclesiastical officers, but missionaries and recognized influencers among the earliest churches. There were amazing people who were able to be bulwarks of the faith, bulwarks of theology. There were amazing people who were able to go from their places where they were, and they give us an example for life. They carried with them the authenticity of the gospel and the true gospel message that they carried through their lives. They didn't exercise authority over churches to say, you do this, you do that, but rather they went and they built up churches, and they made people in those communities the leaders. They distributed authority. They didn't retain it. So they're not high ecclesiastical officers. The apostles give us an example for living and for calling. How are you living? How are you doing with Christ? How are you doing in your calling? How are you doing in your life with where you are? And then finally, and this is kind of the last point, we shouldn't sanctify the apostles beyond any other Christian. They're just as saved as you and me. They're not going to have a bigger mansion in heaven than you or me. They're not going to be more redeemed than you or me. At the end of the day, at the marriage supper of the Lamb, when the last day has come, when the end of the age has appeared, we will sit next to, elbow to elbow, the apostles. They will not be at a head place of the table, but rather they'll be servants among us in the choir that sings to the glory of God. And that's okay. Now, should we look at them as an example for us? Absolutely. Should we say these are people that went out and helped us understand? Yes. But one of the things that we know about Christianity is that our job isn't to lionize people or to sanctify them to be holier than us, but rather to use an example so that we can become holy ourselves. And that is what the apostles give us. That's what they provide us, and that is the story that they leave us in Christian history. And so forth. So with that said, that's kind of our notes for tonight and our lesson. I'll be hanging around to take any questions and so forth. So any other thoughts, any other questions before we split? All right, I'll be right down here if you want to talk. Be happy to do so. Have a wonderful night. Thanks for letting me ramble on for about an hour.